On behalf of the Alumni Association Board, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to the first Thursday program for spring 2009. We're really excited to have you all here. We have lots of events like this, so if you like it, please feel free to come back. We're also always looking for alumni to become more involved and increase connections with the school itself. So we're really excited to have you guys all here. And it's my pleasure also to introduce our speakers tonight, Dr. Ellen DeVoe and Betsy McAllister Groves, excuse me. Ellen DeVoe is a professor here at the School of Social Work practice, and she did her MSW at the University of Denver, and then did her doctoral work at the University of Michigan, where she got a PhD in social work and psychology. Her research has been funded by NIH, CDC, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and now Department of Defense, which you'll hear about a little bit later tonight. And Betsy is the founding director of the Child Witness to Violence Program, which serves young children who have been exposed to domestic and community violence. She is also the associate professor of pediatrics at Boston University School of Medicine. And they're both investigators on a recently funded study by the Department of Defense, which you'll hear about tonight. And they're both my bosses. I'm project coordinator on that study, and they're excellent to work for. Ellen got the Excellence in Teaching Award last year, which is awarded by students at the School of Social Work. And Betsy was elected for the speaker for our graduation last year. I was a graduate in the 2008 class. So thank you guys, and thank you guys for coming. Oh, and
welcome.
Please turn off your cell phones.
I'm Ellen. Can you hear? Let us know if you can't hear us. Am I allowed to stand up back there? Can I stand up? Because I can talk better if I stand up. So let me know if you can hear me. Okay. Let me see.
You're hooked on
What a technology. Okay.
How about if I move this over?
So the first thing we wanted to do is find out who is in the audience, because we're civilians, so that's a big disclaimer for us. But we just wanted to get a sense of whether, are there military folks in the audience? Anybody? Okay. People who are working with veteran populations? Okay. Are most of you social workers? Any psychologists? Nursing? Okay, so that's really helpful. But if you're working with veterans or if you have a military background, you can sort of keep us honest. But we started our DoD project about a year ago, and we have a lot of people working with us, mostly from the MSW program. And we've been spending most of our year trying to establish relationships and get to know the military community, mostly in Massachusetts, but also in New Hampshire and Rhode Island. So we've really learned a lot from these partners at this point. We are required to put this disclaimer here, but the most important one really is that we are civilians, and so our learning curve for our work is really steep, and I have a feeling it will just continue for as long as we're involved in this. Okay. So in order for you to get CEUs, these are our learning objectives, but we wanted to, now I feel like I'm in the Grammys or something. We wanted to introduce the military culture insofar as we understand it at this point. We wanted to talk about some of the challenges that are facing military families with very young children. So our project is focused on kids under 5 who've had a deployed parent. We want to talk a little bit about the cycle of deployment, because if you're familiar with the cycle of deployment, you know that this is it's a very central organizing principle for how military families and the Department of Defense sort of explain the routines of military families. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we'll end just briefly with a little bit of discussion about our project and what we think are some of the issues for the profession of social work at this point. And if you have questions as we go along, just feel free to jump in or raise your hand or let us know. Okay, so the military community. We just have a couple of slides of images, and I guess what we'd ask you to do is think about what they evoke for you. And these are some of the different branches and their logos. Obviously, this is combat. And this is really where we're focused. These are reunion pictures. Well, I like to think of them as reunion pictures. I don't actually know that they are. They might be leaving pictures, but this is really where our project is concerned and what we're thinking about a lot. Okay, so one of our challenges has been to be social workers and then to enter into this military community and this whole military culture. So I think what probably all of you know, but what I think bears repeating is the military family, as opposed to sort of civilians, tend to be very close, especially on bases. But there's this notion of service to my unit or to the group interest before my self-interest. So the collective is more important than the individual. Makes sense in the context of war, that we're all on the same team. And there are strong core values for each service that are slightly different, but you'll recognize them from the media, from TV, or from bumper stickers or whatever. And these are really important to the people that we're working with. And if I've slipped up a few times and said Army instead of Marines, and I get corrected very quickly, and so we're learning. But these are very important. Some differences between active duty and reserve or National Guard. Well, you can see, but so for active duty military folks, they've chosen this as, at least now, they've chosen this as their job or their career. They've entered this voluntarily. We don't have a draft, obviously. We don't have this so much in Massachusetts because of base closures, but in the rest of the country, active duty folks tend to live on the base or near the base, which is very different from being scattered throughout the community. And you can kind of live on the base without having to interact with the civilian world very much if you don't want to. So you can go to the grocery and have your entertainment and you're socializing there, and get all of your health care and that sort of thing on the base. The other thing that we're hearing loud and clear, and I think that is obvious, but is that everyone really gets it. Your neighbors understand what's happening. They understand what deployment is. They understand sort of what you're going through, and they may be going through the same thing. So then for reserve and guard families, which is mostly what we have in Massachusetts and throughout New England, people join the reserves and the guard for very different reasons than they sign up for active duty. And particularly for families or folks who signed up before 9/11, 2001, they signed up thinking that they were going to have a weekend, a month for drill, and then 2 weeks for their longer time. They typically have non-military day jobs or regular jobs, whether they're more career-focused or just jobs, but they tend not to be a military-oriented job. In Massachusetts, they don't have a base, unless they live near Hanscom or Otis, they don't have a base to live close to. So they're very spread out, and we're also working in New Hampshire, and it's particularly relevant in New Hampshire. People are spread out all over the state, and they don't really have a central place to gather. And then some of the issues, your neighbors don't know necessarily that you're involved in the military. If you've got someone's deployed, they don't really understand what that is. They may be against the war and feel very strongly anti-war or anti-Bush, maybe now anti-Obama. But in the military, you can't really talk about that. And so that's your commander in chief, and that's it's very different living in a civilian community. The other thing that I think the DoD and the Guard have recognized and are trying really hard to deal with is that there aren't a lot of community resources for Guard and reserves, for families, and even for veterans when they come back. There's not a centralized place where you can go and get your mental health care and your health care needs met. So those are some of the important differences. Did I miss one? Okay. So this just gives you a pretty recent update on the numbers, but as you can tell, 1.4 million in active duty, 1.1 million reserve. So, we're about 40%, maybe a little higher of reserve components serving in Operation Enduring Freedom, which is Afghanistan, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is Iraq. And you can just see the numbers of kids. So our interest and our concern is that, there are a whole lot of kids being left at home during deployments, and that historically has not been a focus of the VA systems or of the Department of Defense, because, the mission of the DoD is to service the soldier, and the mission of the VA is to service the veteran. So the families can kind of get left behind. Okay. So we're just going to talk about, I just learned about Operation Noble Eagle, actually. Did anyone know about that? We had a presenter at the school who's in the Guard, and she had this term, but Operation Noble Eagle started on September 14th after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And this, it's still in place, but it's basically the air protection of the United States, since now, we're a target. Americans are a target. So what we wanted to talk a little bit about is the nature of current theaters and what we understand that soldiers and service members are experiencing when they go on deployment, and talk about a little bit more about this issue of reliance on a voluntary military. Okay. So some of the issues around citizen soldiers. I mentioned some of them in comparing active duty to reserve. But one of the things that's really affecting Guard and Reserve families is this maximum activation issue. So what activation means is, as far as I understand it, that's when you get your papers and you're activated. Am I getting that right? Good. So this is when you find out that you may be deployed. And that period of total activation increased from 6 to 24 months during these wars. And so that's a huge difference for a civilian who's in the Guard. So we all know that you're supposed to have your job when you come back if you're in the Guard or the Reserve. And with the recession and with things and with multiple deployments, that there's a little more trouble with that. So people are coming back to a different job, or they're coming back to a job that is cut. So there's some problems with that right now. There's a sense sometimes that this isn't what I signed up for, particularly for people who signed up again before 9/11, when we weren't at war, and there's an idea that this could help send you to school or help you meet other goals. And then at the bottom, we just included contract workers. We're not working with contract workers, but these are the real civilians who are not military at all, and they're going over and doing all kinds of transportation, protection, security work in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we don't really have a sense of how many there are and how they're doing when they come back. So they may be showing up in your practices. Okay. So the cycle of deployment. Just quick definitions. Deployment is, this is a definition from a colleague of Betsy's who's she's in the Air Force. So on her original slide, she had deployment is the short-term assignment of a military member to a combat or non-combat zone. I put short in parentheses just because for me, from the perspective of being a parent and a civilian, that 18 months seems like a really long time. That doesn't seem like a short-term thing to me. But anyway, so difference in perspective. So. And soldiers can find out, service members can find out, they can get their activation papers and they can be deployed immediately, or it can sort of drag out, or they may not get deployed at all. And so there's issue in families, well, do I tell my spouse? How do I deal with this with my kids? Should I wait until I really know that I'm going? What if I tell them and I don't go? So there's a lot of kind of turmoil in that pre-deployment period. There also, you've probably seen in the papers and with the media that there also have been some issues or complaints around whether people have been adequately trained to do what they're doing when they get there. And so this is, in your pre-deployment period, you're supposed to be getting trained up for whatever your mission is. Another issue, and this is very relevant for Massachusetts because the Hanscom base is, it's a weapons support mission. So. And it's also relevant for social workers who are in the military and for medical people. But you can be sort of plucked out of your unit and be assigned to go with another unit. So you can be the mental health person or the medic or the weapons support person with a unit that you've never met. So you're suddenly deployed and you're with a whole bunch of people that you don't know. Or you can go with your own unit. But that's a challenging situation. And the mission is important. So. What's a mission? It's basically what the job of the unit is. So it could be a combat mission, it can be a transportation mission, weapons support, logistics, whatever. Combat. One of the interesting issues, or one of the issues around these wars, is that well, what constitutes a combat mission? Because it's there's combat everywhere, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But women still are not allowed to be assigned to combat missions, even though they're doing a lot of they can carry weapons and they can do transportation and that sort of thing, but they aren't technically in combat units. Okay. Okay. This we already went over this, but this is just again the emphasis on how many kids are affected by this and how many families have kids and the parents are being deployed. I mean, this and the last piece, 56% of those with kids have had more than one deployment. And for our age group, for kids under 5, you have parents that may be missing their entire child's life, or kids who are born during deployment and the parent comes back when they're well into their first or second year. And if they have another deployment, obviously they're gone again for a significant developmental period. So I don't know if you can read this. It's kind of small print, but this is just a graphic depiction of the cycle of deployment. And you can see at the top, that's pre-deployment. So this is, I find out I'm gonna be deployed. I may have really a lot of training and a lot of responsibilities related to my deployment and my mission. I got to get my affairs in order. I have to have my family care plan in place. We got to figure out the finances and the wills and all this stuff. And then there's just the emotional component of anticipating when I'm going to be gone, how my family's going to be doing. And you're all clinicians or you're all social workers. So the arguments and sort of distancing and sort of emotionally acting out or handling what's coming up. And then we've learned sort of more recently from some of our families that they may not tell their spouse or their family immediately because they're waiting to see if they're really going to be deployed, or they're just kind of in denial. They don't really want to, they want to leave it for as long as they can. And when the deployment actually happens, as you can imagine, there's a lot of anxiety, overwhelmed. For the person left behind, just can have a lot of reactions to that, but there also can be a lot of relief. Like we're finally, okay, we've been anticipating this. It's finally happening. Let's just deal with it. And so it's very mixed, I think, both for the service member and for the people left behind. Okay. Sustainment. This is I think a really interesting and important piece of the deployment for us. And around sort of supporting families because, in the literature and just from family stories, this is when, for example, a wife is left behind and she suddenly is taking over all the financial responsibilities. She's taking care of childcare. She's holding down a job. She's managing the logistics of her household, and she may not have been doing that before. So on the one hand, it's overwhelming and it's a lot, but on the other hand, it can really create for her, wow, I'm really doing this. I can handle this, and create a new sense of independence. We've also heard from some of the parents that we've talked to that they got a really good routine established for taking care of their kids. And then when mom comes home or dad comes home, they mess it all up because I had this routine for how I was going to deal with this as a single parent, and then you come back and you want to change my routine. And so there's a lot of role, sort of changing roles and renegotiation at this point when people come home. Redeployment, I initially thought was, well, that's going on another deployment, but actually it's just reassignment to come home in the context of this cycle. And again, this is a complicated time too. It's we're almost here. Can we hold out until the service member comes home? There's a lot of anticipation. From the service member side, it can be very distracting because you're sort of counting the days and you don't want to take your focus off staying safe wherever you are. And from the home front, there can be this sort of exhaustion, that you hold it together and then I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and just kind of things can start to crack up a little bit. So some of the providers that we've worked with have said, you really need to come in a couple months before the service member comes home because that's when family members really need the support. They've kept it together for this period of time and they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but now they're really tired. And so that's when they could use our support. Okay, and then the honeymoon period, or the post-deployment period, this is called the reintegration period. And this is when, the service member actually gets home. There's the honeymoon period, which you can imagine. So there's a lot of, reunion and everything's great and going on vacation and reconnecting and family, get-togethers and barbecues and that sort of thing. But then there can also be this sort of loss of independence for the person who was left behind. And then from our perspective, looking at parents, I as the service member, how do I fit in? Or my child doesn't know me. How am I going to get to know my child? There can also be, this isn't the guy that I married. He's really different. Or there's an injury or disability that has to be addressed. And so, there's just a lot of renegotiation and adjusting during this period. And we've had a lot of providers say, don't even bother for the first 90 days because it's still the honeymoon. So things are going to start to pop up and become more challenging after you get through that honeymoon period. And then, of course, the other issue, which isn't on here, is because of multiple deployments, you can be in post-deployment and pre-deployment at the same time. So you're just adjusting, you're kind of getting used to being back home, and then you get your papers again. So there's been this, really difficult cycle for a lot of families. Okay, so one of the things that we've tried to do is figure, learn as much as we can about what it must be like for the service member who's in a combat environment. I'm going to find my notes. So these are just some basic elements of being over there, whether you're on a combat mission or not. But so some of the, and you all know a lot of this, but in contrast to earlier conflicts and other wars, the enemy here is not necessarily visible. It's who is the enemy. The enemy could be anyone or anyone or everywhere. We know that women and children and civilians are certainly participating in some, to some degree, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's this ubiquitous threat of IUDs, roadside bombs, suicide bombers, civilian involvement, civilian casualties, which we don't hear very much about, but estimates are up, maybe above 120,000 Iraqi civilians at this point. It's kind of hard to get a good number on that, or an accurate number, not a good number. Mass graves, especially in the early part of the Iraq War, and morgue duty are just sort of basic elements. The chemical and biological threat issue has sort of died down since the beginning of the Iraq War, but at the beginning, service members were having to deal with chemical weapons suits, and this was a big, because of the heat and because of the weight of the suits, and they were very cumbersome and incredibly uncomfortable. And so just the discomfort of being in this environment, even if you don't have a lot of combat going on. And we've heard, and it's been written, just that it can be a very harsh climate. So we've heard a lot about sanitation and privacy issues, and just how harsh it is to be in, living with all of your troop and with not so good sanitation for the period of time that we require during deployment. Okay, so have any of you heard of BattleMind, or is that familiar? Okay, have you used it? Or
I've been part of it.
okay, so I wanted to just introduce BattleMind because for us, I think it's been a really helpful resource as civilians. But BattleMind is a training that was developed, and you can just Google it and find your way through lots of different pieces of it. And we'll show a couple of video clips from BattleMind. But BattleMind training, as I understand it, is it's a multi-level training component that provides information and training for leadership, for service members, and also for families. And there's no reason why we as mental health professionals can't access it too. But the idea behind BattleMind is these are the realities of combat and of war, and we need to understand them and deal with them in a very straightforward way. And then we need to, from a leadership perspective, this is how we need to equip our service members so that they have the best chance to survive whatever we're asking them to do. So that's the BattleMind piece. And then the other piece is, and this is why your BattleMind may not work when you go home. So what works over there, and what's very adaptive in the context of combat or a deployment, is not maybe so helpful when you go back to your cul-de-sac. And And so it's very helpful in sort of trying to give information about this is why we need to think in this way when we're in battle. And then these are some ways in which you need to reset or think about, trying to be different. And it's not so easy. If somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not like I can just, I understand that and I'm going to flip a switch. But it's just helpful in lots of resources. So it shows, this is from a leadership training that was developed out of Walter Reed. And I just include it because it's so straightforward. And it doesn't, there's no pussyfooting around, but I like their title, 10 Unpleasant Facts About Combat. Well, these are definitely unpleasant facts, but you can read them. But they're very straightforward, and I think it's a way that leaders and that units can try to deal with what's going to happen when they encounter combat. So we expect that you're going to be afraid. And in the full training, there's a lot of information about how people respond with fear. So you may lose bladder or bowel control. You may not be able to, you may run the other way. So it gives a lot of information about just a normal fear response that, you don't think of when you think of a big Marine guy. Let's see. The other thing that BattleMind is trying to accomplish is to destigmatize mental health concerns and mental health, responses that we know that service members are having. So combat it's going to affect you. It's going to affect you mentally. It's going to affect you emotionally, and that's expectable. So they're really trying to work the angle of mental health so that people can get help. These are the rest of the unpleasant facts, but so you can just read them. But one of the other things that I think is important for us clinically and in terms of our project looking at families is, yes, deployments place a tremendous strain on families. And, again, the family hasn't really been the focus of the VA or the Department of Defense until very recently. And there's the VA actually is now requiring that family and group-related interventions or programs be put into place. And that's clearly a social work responsibility. And the last one, I think, is also important for our work, and that's that combat poses moral and ethical challenges. I don't like to think about what someone might have had to do or might have faced, but that's certainly something that we have to help service members with when they come back. And I think we probably have to grapple with how we're going to deal with that and how we're going to respond to somebody who we might be working with. But so I would check out BattleMind if you want to get more into this. Okay. So this is just from a survey of OIF service members, and you can see these are fairly common experiences that service members will run into. If you're interested in diagnosing for PTSD, these would all be criterion A qualifiers, but they're fairly common. The research also shows that handling dead bodies and seeing people, seeing dead or seriously injured Americans or civilian Iraqis or Afghanis, that is correlated with higher levels of symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Another sort of piece of the picture for this, thinking about this post-deployment cycle and for reintegration, when we may come into contact with service members, this is war in the 21st century. So in addition to sort of the specifics of combat environment in Iraq or Afghanistan, we've just advanced in our ability to document war, to communicate in real time. Because of medical advances, this is wonderful that the mortality rate for service members has been cut dramatically. But on the other side, we've got a lot more service members coming home with disabilities or injuries or traumatic brain injury, and those people would have died, if this were Vietnam or an earlier conflict. Another issue is the rapid transition from war to home. If you think about World War II or even Vietnam, it took you a while to get from your deployment site back to your home. And so you had a little bit of time to decompress, to just sort of try to reorient yourself. I mean, even that time wasn't enough. But now you can get home in 72 hours. You're back in the States. And so on the one hand, that's wonderful that we can get people home that quickly. But it's also very demanding and difficult for the service member just to make that adjustment. I mean, think about the last time you came home from vacation and how long it took you to just sort of get back into your job. The media coverage in real time and embedded journalism, this is more of an issue for the families. So I as a spouse, if my husband or partner is deployed, how am I going to handle the media? Am I going to be, am I going to track this all the time? Am I going to shut it out? How am I going to deal with my children and what they're going to be able to learn from the media from when they turn on the computer or go on the internet? So this is a big issue. The communication piece, we've also, just from our very, we've interviewed 20 service members at this point, but communication is also a double-edged sword, because I can email, I can Skype, I can use a webcam, I can sometimes call, but I don't know if so for some families it's not helpful to be in regular contact, because the contact is so difficult to sort of keep it meaningful. And so we heard from one mom who said, well, I really wanted my husband to say, I love you, I miss you, how you doing? And he was just kind of giving me the rundown of the day. And so there are some disconnects in how helpful the communication is. The other thing that we've, just anecdotally, that families work out very different strategies of their patterns of communication. So one father that we interviewed said he's been deployed and he's about to be redeployed. And he said, well, I always initiate the call. She never does, because I know her schedule and she can't possibly know mine. And I keep it random, because if we get into a regular routine of communication and then I can't call her for a week because I'm somewhere else or communication's down or whatever, then she's in a panic. So there are all these sort of, how are you going to negotiate, and how can we as providers help families maybe think through some of those strategies. And then the other issue, I don't know if people know about this, but for the long deployments, for the 18-month deployments, service members can have a 2-week R&R in the middle. And this is also very double-edged. So families, they're looking forward to that 9 months, and they really want to see their families, and some families have been able to meet in Europe or whatever, but then all hell breaks loose, and the family at home is readjusting for a pretty long time to, well, why did Daddy leave again? And the next 9 months feels really long. So that's also been sort of characterized by some of our families as double-edged. Okay, how am I doing on time? So I think this is, you all read the paper, you know what the media is saying, but the take home from this is there's some post-traumatic stress disorder. We're not paying as much attention to anxiety disorders and depression. We're hearing in the media a lot more about substance abuse, domestic violence, and the elevated suicide rate in service members. But probably a lot of this is underdiagnosed, just because service members don't want to. They either, they fill out their PDHAs just so they can get through the process and get home, or they don't want to reveal that they're having difficulties because they're concerned about the ramifications for their career, the stigma associated still in some places with getting mental health care. This stat of 60,000 cases diagnosed PTSD, that comes from our Boston VA, Mel Tapper, who's in charge of the OEF program there. The other issue with what people are coming home with is, for lack of a better, but signature injuries. So things like blast injuries, traumatic brain injury, and the other one that hadn't occurred to me, but someone from the Boston VA suggested that the signature injury for this war actually is low back injuries, because of equipment and because of just the way they're having to maneuver. So those are other things that we don't necessarily think about, but that we should be paying attention to. Okay. I need to roll up so Betsy can talk. But so these are some battle mind concepts just that I think are very relevant for clinical work and sort of helpful for clinical work. But also just to think about what does this person have to, what kind of mindset do they have to be able to do what they need to do. And the two that I think are really important for us are, when a soldier's at war, his mind should be at peace. And so if you know that your family at home is doing okay and well supported, then you're going to be in better shape to just focus on what you need to do. And that's safer for the service member, because if I'm distracted about, how my family's doing, whether my kids are being taken care of, is the first sergeant calling my wife, then I'm not as peaceful as if I know things are taken care of and I can just focus on what I need to do. So that's one issue. The other is that every service member needs to come home with a story that he or she can live with. And again, this comes from the training for leadership in the military, but I think it's very relevant for us in working with people who are coming home and who are trying to create stories that they can live with, and we're trying to support that. Okay. Okay, so this is the video. Do I have time for this? So we're going to try to make this work. But these are 2 video clips that I think are good illustrations of kind of what works over there, doesn't work over here. And you can get these on the internet if you just Google Battle Mind. So the first one is buddies, and the second one is a father-son.
Which one do
I think we'll go do that one.
Hey man, you alright? I'm fine. Let's just get out of here. Let's get out of here.
I don't know if you can see it, but he loaded into the back. He's got a duffel bag with guns in it, basically, and so he just loaded that into his truck because I don't know, he was going somewhere. But and you see the driving. So we've heard, we actually have some families who talked about the way that their spouses drive when they come home because they were driving and doing transport in Iraq, and one woman described her husband as he scans like this when he drives, and driving erratically there was adaptive, and driving erratically here obviously is not so good. So then the second one is a father-son scene, and I think it's pretty, well, you'll see, but this is a good on train to the next.
Hey kid, let's go outside and shoot some hoops. Hey, come on. It's a beautiful day outside. You're going for here. Work on that jump shot, you know?
Soon as it was happening.
Come on. You're going for a year. Let's spend some time together.
Try to use this new tactical rifle shooting. Hey Dad, what's that bag?
We're all right now, you know? I'm trying to watch the fight here. I mean, come on.
Looks good at the dog
Hey,
show.
well, you know, just scram, you know? I'm trying to watch the fight here.
I just wanted to say you wanted to play.
Hey, you know what? Why don't you just go play with some of your other friends? Or better yet, how about your uncle? You know, because he seems to got all kinds of pointers and time to play with you. So why don't you go play with him?
But Dad,
Hey, what did I say? Get out of here.
Okay. I think particularly that second clip is a powerful way to transition into thinking a little bit more specifically about the impact of deployment and the combat experience on children, and also beginning to talk a little bit about what we are hoping to do with this project and the intervention. So I'll just say briefly before I start that piece of the talk that I'm grateful to the Alumni Association for having us here and giving us the opportunity to talk about this, and also to add that I'm a graduate of BU School of Social Work. So it's doubly nice to be here, and I have at least 2 of my classmates in the audience, which is extra nice. So let me start by sharing with you a little bit about what we have learned from research about the impact of war on parenting and families. And I guess I would preface this by saying that as we were preparing the grant and as we've been trying to get up to speed with this project, it's been surprising. We've done a lot of look at the literature, and Abby and Rendy and various of the staff have been hugely helpful in tracking down things. And there's surprisingly little out there about the impact of PTSD, particularly combat-related trauma, on parenting. There's a lot of information, as most of you know, about the impact of PTSD on the individual service member. And there also is a good deal of information about the impact of trauma on the couple's relationship. But when it comes to looking at the parenting piece, there's less there, and that's the piece that I think we are really interested in and that we're trying to focus on. So I'm just going to show you briefly a few of the studies that we found and also talk about what we're beginning to learn from the interviews. As Ellen said, we are in the process, this is phase 1 of the program, of interviewing service members and spouses to really understand from their perspective their experiences. So if you look at deployment, first of all, this is just a few studies that have looked at the impact of deployment on the spouses, on the partners who are left home. One study, as you see from the dates, some of this research, actually a fair amount of it, was done looking at Vietnam War veterans and that era of combat. So one study that looks at the mental health symptoms, and as you all know from that era, it was only men who were deployed. So this study looking at women's increased symptoms of emotional distress, depression, and increased stress. Studies that have looked at just general family cohesion and structure. And then this study, which is more recent, 2007, that looked at rates of child maltreatment in families with a deployed service member and found significantly elevated rates, I think 2-fold rates, of child maltreatment by civilian females during deployment. And then looking at the impact on children, another set of studies here. Again, the first studies that have found that children have a range of, an increase in a range of behavior problems. The most recent study, Chartrand 2008, is actually done by my colleague at Boston Medical Center, Molly Chartrand, who's a pediatrician, Air Force pediatrician, and did really interesting research on preschoolers at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Marine Base, to look at how preschoolers were affected by deployment. And she found, a significant rate of increased behavior problems with kids ages 3 to 6. Less clear about the very young kids, but that age group, there were behavior problems. Earlier research looking at symptoms of depression and anxiety. Again, we have here, this is a repeat, the same child maltreatment study. And then I think this study, which is interesting because it begins to look at health effects on, in this case, adolescents who had a family member who were deployed, who found higher blood pressure and also higher self-perceived rates of stress with adolescents. And I would add to this that I think in our own experiences as we are interviewing families, There have been a couple of things that have struck me in particular, and I think one is for the family members, the fact that during deployment, each parent has a significantly different experience, and I know Ellen has referred to that earlier, and that upon reunion or reintegration, it is often very difficult for each parent to talk with the other about the experience. I think for the service member, many times it's emotionally painful to talk about the experience. The service member wants to protect the family or the spouse from some of the emotional impact. And I think from the spouse's perspective, there is a sense of wanting to not talk about perhaps how stressful it was, but to kind of keep that contained so that the experiences become kind of the elephants in the room around communication. And it's hard for each spouse to understand the perspective of the other. And I think when you add the child's perspective into that, you can begin to see the many complications there, because I think that in many cases the child's perspective isn't fully understood or acknowledged. And this is most particularly true when it comes to preschoolers and very young children, who obviously have a limited capacity to tell us verbally about what this experience was like. And I think the other thing we've heard about is the demands of the changing roles within the family. And again, I think Ellen alluded to that. I think particularly about this poignant story that a woman told me. This actually is an Army pediatrician who was deployed twice, and in her first deployment she had 2 children, ages I think around 13 months and 3, as I recall. And she talked about the process of kind of letting go of the parenting role, and she told this story about they communicated by video camera. So in one chat with her husband and kids, it was she could see the kitchen, the refrigerator in their home, and the older child went to open the refrigerator and pulled out something like chocolate milk, I think it was. It was something that was sweet. And the pediatrician said, I never let my kids have that when I was home. That was against the rules. And so she was kind of, visually faced with this fact that the rules are different. And she had to let go of that, and that was hard for her in some ways. So I think that's one example of how the role shift can become challenging at times. Then if we move on now to talk more specifically about the experience of combat stress or combat trauma, I think the first thing that I would want to say about this is that I think one of the things that we have learned is that we cannot assume that every deployed service member will come back with traumatic stress, or certainly not PTSD. And I think that there's concern, and this is actually one of the things that Molly Chartrand reminded me over and over again, that there is a continuum of individuals and families' experiences, and that we have to be open to understanding and learning about the individual experiences, the individual vulnerabilities, and the individual strengths of each family member. So having said that, as I said earlier, there are very few studies about the impact of parental PTSD in this case on children. A couple of studies, these are both done with Vietnam War vets. I think their findings are not surprising at all, basically that children of vets with PTSD have behavior problems. They have more behavior problems than veterans without PTSD. And these are veterans who may have another mental health diagnosis, but not PTSD. And also the children of vets with PTSD and violent behavior had more behavior problems than children of vets without violent behavior. Again, this is not terribly surprising, I think. But one study we found that I think really is interesting looks at how, okay, so we can agree that PTSD affects parenting, but how? What is the mechanism, or what is the pathway? What is it about PTSD that may be more toxic, if you will, for parenting? So this study looked at symptom clusters in PTSD and correlated that with parenting difficulties. So they looked at numbing, avoidance, hyperarousal, re-experiencing. And what they found was that it was the severity of emotional numbing that was most highly associated with poor parent-child relationships. So it was that sense of detachment, emotional, lack of emotional availability, withdrawing that seemed to be the most stressful for parent-child relationships. And I actually think that second battle mind clip gives you a sense of that. I mean, it's kind of the miscommunication opportunities, but the sense, certainly in the second half of that, of the father just being so withdrawn and emotionally unavailable. So if we begin to think about stresses on the parent-child relationship, now this is after trauma in general, and I'm going to make the disclaimer that, you know, we have to be careful about overgeneralizing here. But I think based, and I think about some of my work at Boston Medical Center where I've worked with traumatized parents. In this sense, the traumatized parent is most often a woman, a mother who's a victim of domestic violence. But I think the principles hold. How does parental trauma affect child-parent relationships? So what we find is that oftentimes the traumatized parent has a decreased capacity to be attuned to the child, that the traumatized parent has an impaired capacity for regulating affect. You see that in both of the clips that Ellen showed, and that this regulatory capacity affects both the parent and the child. We also see children who have impaired regulatory capacities. We also see that both the parent and the child may serve as traumatic reminders to each other. I think back again to this interview with the pediatrician who talked about when she came home, the first time, and I'm going to forget the specifics of the story, but there was some reason why she needed to put her uniform on again, and her younger child burst into tears seeing the uniform again. So it really was a kind of traumatic reminder for that child. And I think also that children's behavior, children's activities can be traumatic reminders for parents. So we have heard about kids who are extremely loud, or sudden noises that are associated with child behaviors being a trigger for parents. Okay. So who is at greatest risk for suffering adverse emotional effects or impairment from the war? This again is summarizing research. This is not our work. So young families, more recently married families, lower ranking service members, families with younger children, families with prior mental health stresses, families who weren't functioning well before deployment for some reason, and again, possibly reserve and guard families. And that is because of the isolation that the lack of community, supportive community, for one reason anyway. So this is some sense of the risk factors that we may be looking at.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can you just go back?
Yep.
The lower-ranking service member families, do you think that is correlated possibly with education and income there too? I mean, I don't know, I'm just making the assumption that if you're lower-ranking, then your income is lower for educational attainment.
Yeah, I think that is a correct assumption. And I have to say, I don't believe that I don't know that they speculated why that was.
Okay.
I think we may also be talking about age as a factor there. And yeah, was there a comment?
I just wanted to add that your education might not necessarily reflect your rank.
Right.
That's a good
but
point.
it could be the fact that because you're lower ranking, you get worse jobs. So
Okay.
you might be more likely to get more duty as opposed to an officer who wouldn't necessarily have to do that.
Thank you. I also think about income, particularly for reserve and guard, that lower income. And Ellen, were you going to?
It's to your point, it may be also mission,
Yeah.
and what the actual jobs were. If you're infantry, you're lower ranking typically, except for the leaders.
Okay, so I am now going to show you, hopefully, a brief clip that brings us the voices of children directly. And this is a clip, this is a larger, longer-running video clip that was filmed at a summer camp in New Hampshire for children of deployed service members. And these are as Ellen said, we're focusing on preschoolers. These are not preschoolers, as you will see. They're older kids and some adolescents. But I think they really speak powerfully about the impact on them.
Now, so she has to like take care of me and my brother by herself. So I take on a lot of that now. It just like stresses me out more, so that we just don't get along a lot. Not able to do as much. Like he bought me his soccer and he did a lot of stuff with Boy Scouts.
He's kind of the base of our family. So without him, things don't go too smooth.
Well, he went earlier and he was supposed to come back like sooner, but the way we understood it for some months or something, because they had to keep him longer. So I didn't like that. I got mad because like the people said mine because they said he'd be back at a certain time, but then they changed it. And they shouldn't, if they think they're gonna change it, they shouldn't even say when he's gonna be back.
Well, schoolwork is hard. He's a great math position. And my mom does not know math over what we're teaching now. She's not too up on algebra.
My dad used to coach for my baseball team, so, I mean, that was way before, but, I mean, I made the freshman basketball team when he was gone, so he never let us see one of my games, so that was pretty tough for me.
And then there was 3 of us, and we couldn't drive, so there was one chauffeur and all 3 of us kids, and we were all involved in a lot of different things, so it made it a lot harder for us to get places that we wanted to go. We also told me like 3 weeks in advance, so we wanted to go somewhere. And we wouldn't get there, but we were.
It's just hard to not concentrate on him being gone. But then you're almost everything. And then you feel like you're broken down. Like a piece of you's left in forever. She was scared a lot.
Yeah, the last time he was in town, he got wrecked. What you hear on the news is horrible. It's like, oh, my wreck and another body, and you just like, please don't let it be attached because that's what my dad is. And he was like telling us, oh, it's the safest base, don't worry, I'm fine, you know. But he knows that it's like not the safest base. And so every time you like look at the news, like you're like, God, be quiet, I really want to watch this because you know your dad's over there and there's bombing and you just cry, please, like that, okay. But now he's way up in Turkey, so I believe he's wicked safe. And the pictures he sends home, he's so happy with the kids there. And it's,
Do you mind? Okay, thank you. I think the children speak incredibly powerfully about their experiences. And I think they remind us that again, that the responses are individual, that the efforts to cope are individual. I appreciate the girl at the end who talks about, I mean, it's interesting too, because I think this thread of what you hear on the news and how the media informs at least these children's, awareness and understanding. So the girl at the end who is clearly trying to cope by kind of using intellectual defenses about, well, if he's here, he's going to be safe. If he's somewhere else, he won't be safe. And the little boy who talks about his father being gone, being like a part of him is gone. Again, I think these children remind us that there are a range of ways to cope. And we know that stressful experiences for children and adults are experienced in many different ways. I put up here something we think about in our work when we're looking at traumatic experiences with children. What are stressors and what are traumas, and what is that continuum from what may be a passing or even a positive stress to a tolerable stress that may have short-term impacts on children, and then what is a toxic stress or a chronic stress. And I think a part of what we're trying to learn in interviewing and doing this work is about this continuum for children, and it is a continuum. And also, I think the reminder that, as you all know, I mean, one adverse event is unlikely to derail most children, and it's the accumulation of events that becomes worrisome. And so how do we think about mobilizing? I mean, if you think about risk factors and protective factors, and you look at families' individual ecologies, that a part of what I think we all need to think about is which pieces can we mobilize to support families and children. And obviously our particular project is really working at this level. It's working to try to support, enhance, improve family relationships following the stressors of deployment. I think for time's sake, I'm going to simply make the point that children's reactions to parental separation varies by age. I'm sure all of you know that. And we, obviously, interventions need to be tailored. If you're working with children, need to be tailored to what's developmentally appropriate for the particular age group. For us, it's preschoolers. So let me shift now to talking briefly about what we are doing, what we're hoping to do. So our grant is to create a family-focused intervention to support military families with young children during the post-deployment period. And I think that's lifted from the grant. That's the language there. So as we have begun to do this, we have put a lot of time and energy into trying to find what's out there that can help us. What do we know about interventions that relate to this? And I just want to briefly talk about some of what we found. So if you look at family-focused interventions to support military families, there are not models that we're aware of yet that have focused specifically on preschool-age children. A model that we have looked at that works with children ages 7 up through adolescence, I think 7 or 8 up and through adolescence, is a program called Focus. It's an intervention for reintegrating returning soldiers. It was developed out of Camp Pendleton by two researchers there, Patricia Lester and William Saltzman. And they have gotten significant support from the Navy and are using this model widely, I think in at least 9 or 10 different naval installations. And it's a short-term, educationally focused intervention. And it really, it has kind of two primary goals or focuses. One is to help parents be able to talk to each other about the perspective. And then the second is to bring the kids into it and to help all members of the family be able to create a shared narrative about the deployment experience. So that's kind of one overarching goal. And the second overarching goal is to provide psychoeducation about the impact of combat stress on the individual and on the family. So essentially, how can the family better understand the service member's potential change in behavior, emotional lability, etc. So that's one intervention we've looked at. And then a second one that's been very helpful to us is actually one that was developed right here in Boston at Children's Hospital by Bill Beardsley and colleagues. This is the intervention that is also a psychoeducationally kind of strength-based intervention that is helping families with a depressed parent, a depressed adult. And again, the goal in this intervention, quite broadly, is to provide psychoeducation about depression to all family members, to help the child make sense out of the experiences that child has with the parent, and to provide positive activities and experiences for the family. Actually, both of these do this. So this intervention is 6 to 8 sessions, is done in home or office. The Lester Saltzman one is home-based. So that's kind of one set of interventions that we've looked at. And if you think about it, I think the common elements here are that the goals of both of these are to have increased awareness both of the parent and the child perspective of the experience. To provide education to family members about the experience, about the condition of the parent to all families, to help parent and child understand how the illness that's using Beardsley's intervention particularly, but how the experience affects parenting, to help the parent and the child be able to talk about this together. But you have to stop and think, what do we mean by talking about it if we're talking about very young children? And then also to encourage and promote activities that provide enjoyment and pleasure. So that's kind of one set of interventions that we've looked at. And then the other set of interventions are those interventions that are designed very specifically for preschoolers and infants. And the researchers or practitioners that we've looked at are the works of Alicia Lieberman, Mary Dozier, Arietta Slade, Susan McDonough, and they were all created for parents and children ages birth to 6. Some of these focus more specifically on very young children and infants, others on preschoolers. But the focus of these interventions is to really focus on the parent-child dyad and to increase the parent capacity to recognize and respond to the child's needs, to kind of read the child's cues, respond to the child's needs, and to help the parent reflect on or interpret the meaning of children's behaviors. All of these interventions can be either home or office-based. Many of them incorporate the use of videotaping as the vehicle to help to teach parents about child-parent relationships. So that's some of what we've been thinking about, and I will end this now, my piece of this, by briefly describing the grant. So we have named ourselves Strong Families, Strong Forces. As Ellen said, it's a 4-year grant from the Department of Defense. The primary goal is to develop and evaluate a post-deployment reintegration program for military families with young children, and we're defining that as birth to age 6. It is a phased 4-year grant. We are in the midst of phase 1. We are about 2/3 of the way through year 1, right? Am I about right about that? 2/3 of the way through. So the first phase, as Ellen mentioned, is building collaborations with our military partners and beginning to understand the perspective of families. And the vehicle to do that are interviews. We are doing interviews with service members, with spouses, with a range of key informants, experts in the field, focus groups with child care providers so that we can better understand, again, the perspective of children. And all of this is to inform the intervention. I think we have covered most of these themes that we're beginning to hear. The struggle that I think service members are telling us about trying to pick up where they left off, finding some relevance or meaning in their experience. We've also heard fairly universally about frustration with lack of support for families during deployment. Yeah.
Is this program primarily for the reserve and guard who can come into an office, or is this program also for military on bases that don't have that access?
The program is available for anyone, any service member. It will be. We are, when we wrote the grant, we could not designate which military population we wanted to work with. We were told that that would be assigned to us. And what has happened, practically speaking, is essentially because we had a travel budget in there initially, right? A reasonable travel budget. It got axed by the Department of Defense. So we are working in New England, essentially. And most of our service member interviews are within about a 2.5 hour radius of us. And that means that we are primarily working with reserve and guard families. But we will be available to anyone. I'm aware of time. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So we are building an intervention. So we're in the midst of designing that. We will pilot it. I mean, I think what we feel fairly confident of at this point, that it will be home or office based. It will be flexible. It will be strengths based. It will have a significant component of information and training and focus on family relationships. So we'll pilot it, we'll revise based on the results of the pilot and input from stakeholders, and then we will offer it and evaluate using randomized trial. So that's over the 4, and if it's successful, it will be disseminated, we hope. So that's the long-range view. So I'm going to turn this back over there.
This is very quick, just to sort of wrap up, but we wanted to just make a few comments about the bigger picture for the profession of social work. And these are some of our thoughts. I think the main take-home and what we're understanding is that we need to think about all of our cultural competence, cultural relevance models, and apply this to being civilians working with the military. We are definitely entering a different culture, and we're outsiders, and we need to learn about it and be incredibly respectful of sort of what we don't know and how we enter the community. We've gotten a lot of, from military providers in particular, or civilians who work with the military, there's a lot of fear around how we might come in and characterize service members and their problems, and that we're going to over-pathologize, and we're only going to see the weakness. We're not going to see the pride and the honor and the duty and the resilience of many, many families. And so we're treading very carefully and trying to learn as much as we can. Then some bigger issues that we've run across at conferences and among ourselves, just just tensions between the profession as a very activist, historically anti-war, liberal profession. I mean, that's sort of stereotypical, but we're in Massachusetts. And what that means for working with veteran populations. There's actually a conference, and I can't remember the name, but Harvard's putting on a conference that addresses this very issue. It's trying to resolve the activism and the anti-war work that was based in Harvard, or at Harvard, during Vietnam. And so then how do we now resolve these tensions and differences between military populations and academia generally, but for us, social work. And this has even come up around the name of our project among us as well. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to sort of patch families back together so we can send them back to war? Well, yes, that's what we're trying to do. And so that's what the military's mission is, and that's what supporting families, that's what the military does. And so we're going to be a part of that. So anyway, so we're kind of operating from separate the warrior from the wars. You can be anti-war but not anti-warrior. We're hoping that everybody will understand that we don't want to repeat Vietnam in terms of how Vietnam veterans were received. Okay, so I mean, those are the main take-homes, and we'll stop there. We've talked for, a few more things. Just in terms of in terms of social work as in terms of training, I think there aren't very many places in the country where you can go to an MSW program and get a lot of really good training. I mean, we have wonderful placements in the VA, certainly, and some postmaster's fellowship kinds of opportunities within the VA system. But we don't have, there aren't courses at BU, for example, or even maybe in Boston on working with veteran populations and what some of the military issues are. But at the very least, we think that we should be doing a better job with teaching and training around trauma-informed intervention, whether it's with military populations or otherwise. We want to make sure that we know what's available. There are definitely disciplinary issues, disciplinary meaning psychology, social work, psychiatry, and around how we are perceived as social workers and what we're competent to treat. There are lots of, probably some of you are familiar with these, but there's a perception in some quarters that social workers are not equipped to teach veterans who have PTSD, and we certainly want to make sure that that's not the case. I don't think that is the case, but we want to make sure that we are as up to date as everybody else. Okay, so I think that's it. Questions? Comments?
Is it possible to have the lights?
Make referrals to your program.
Not yet. But we
You can refer. You can call Abby.
good.
You call me.
But I do think it's important to stress, we do not have an intervention yet. We don't have one, no. We're in the process, yes, this summer we hope that we will have one. It's probably important to say that we are still very interested in talking with service members and spouses. So certainly if any of you know of service members who have children under the age of 6, who've been deployed, Call, Abby, is your number up there?
No.
Okay.
But you
Email.
can email that, and it's also off the website. And even if you know people who have not been deployed yet, are going, anybody who has kids under 5 who is concerned, we're happy to serve as a resource for them as well. It's not necessarily just specific for those folks who qualify for phase 1.
I had a couple of things to offer, and I've been working the last couple of years working a program to support parents who are recovering with significant mental illness or substance abuse and trauma. And two things, just quickly. One is that the perspective of the kinds of interventions, do you view yourself as doing a treatment intervention and providing treatment, or do you kind of view yourself as sort of a more rehabilitative and recovery kind of process that you're engaging with them? To think that through. And I think I would encourage you to look at it more as this process as a recovery and rehabilitative one versus a treatment intervention, particularly for the adults who may have some significant kinds of mental health or substance abuse conditions that they're struggling with. And it's sort of adjusting to the impact of this change in their homeostasis, but also with these other underlying conditions. The other thing is I would highly encourage a peer component, self-help peer component to your interventions. It's very powerful. It's probably one of the most effective things that we've seen and we're trying to build into. There's nothing like being able to kind of share that experience with somebody who's been through it and helping you kind of cope with it, find another way to adjust with it and get on with your life. So those are just two things I'd offer.
Thank you.
We should say, we aren't conceptualizing our project or our program as treatment or intervention. We are very clear about not treating PTSD, not treating if there's a primary mental health problem or issue, that should go somewhere else. Yeah.
But that's kind of an integral part of this person's attempt to resume their role as a parent too. They're also trying to kind of recover from that experience with that experience too. And it's kind of all integrated in there. So treatment has to be a part of it, but how do you conceptualize the overall experience? And there's this kind of, kind of process that goes on over time, and that sometimes, so that I know that you're kind of thinking about a short-term intervention, but I think that kind of helping the family, helping the military, whoever, to think about this as a capacity to access this process, because that recovery from that disruption in their lives is going to be variable, and how it's going to impact them is going to go over time. And so that's another piece to kind of think about and how you're going to build in.
Yes. Now, from my perspective, as I work for the VA, have you? And I saw all of your. It's nice to see Mel Tapper's work up there. Yeah. I saw a lot of the sources were clinical based, PTSD, trauma. Are you taking into account traumatic brain injury in any of your studies?
We will, in what way? I mean, we know that we will see service members with TBI.
Right, and you'll probably see more than you realize.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, a lot of the symptoms that would be put up there as PTSD are actually,
I
they
see
could
what
also
you
be
mean.
TBI injuries, so you may
Yep.
want to factor that in as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about a couple of concepts on that battle mind training of wanting warriors to come home with a story that they can live with, and juxtaposing that with the model for PTSD and parenting, of how you try to build a shared narrative between the parents and the child on the deployment. Can you just say a little bit about what happens with, let's say, the real toxicity of the deployment, the real trauma part that could, what are veterans supposed to do with that? How do you build a story that you can live with? Is it fictional? How much is fictional? How much is nonfiction?
I mean, I can think it. Well, I think about, because the Saltzman-Lester model has dealt with that very specifically, and what they talk about is their version of creating a story that one can live with is a somewhat, I can only think of the word sanitized, but it is not the kind of vivid reliving of an experience, but it is a story that one can manage to talk about emotionally. And they also are, I think your question about treatment versus rehabilitation, that if a service member is suffering from PTSD or significant traumatic stress, there's treatment outside of the home-based intervention. So it's a kind of manageable version, if that makes sense. Would you add to that, Ellen? Does that make sense?
I mean, I don't know tell me if I'm responding to your question, but one example that a service member gave to me was that battle mind is if I'm driving a tank into a city and I'm the driver, my mission, I have to keep driving no matter what gets in my way, including women, children, whatever is thrown in front of me, I got to keep driving because that's my mission, that's my battle mind, that keeps me. And so, you can kind of extrapolate from there. So then how do I come home and live with that and create a story that I can live with? Now, that's not what you're going to tell your kids.
Right.
But to kind of, the battle mind, this is the context of the what I had to be doing. And then, and coming home and figuring out a way to, that was my job, that was my duty, I did a good job, I can be proud of myself, I don't have, dealing with the shame pieces of it. And then the other layer is, well, so then how is the story going to work out in the family? But does that sort of
helpful? Thank you.
Are you working primarily with families with one family member who's being deployed, or are you doing some with families with both parents being deployed and sometimes at the same time?
I think in my ideal, if I could design it as a really clean research project, I'd pick only this. But I think at this point, the reality is that, they're going to be single parents who are deployed. They're going to be dual active duty, deployed at the same time. And I think at this point, we'll try to work with everyone and see if we can create a model that really can be flexible enough to work with all sorts of family structures.
So put either type of family in touch with Abby then?
Yes.
Okay.
All.
Have you seen a significant difference between families where the father was the military person deployed versus families where the mother was the military person deployed? Or is that not?
I don't think we've seen enough families yet to be able to reach any conclusions about that. I think we are mostly women on the project, though, so I think that the women tend to, at least for me, I resonate with that quite a bit, so that affects me differently than working with the men, but, that's just me. So.
I was wondering how much work, if any, one of the things that I've seen, I don't work in a military field, I just work in a hospital, but in families that have come through with some of the reserve families, it seems like, eventually people have the option of getting out, that the father doesn't have to re-sign up. And that seems to be, I've had families get divorced over that, and that seems to be this really critical time where the parent's making a decision sort of to re-sign up, and the mother's saying, you've been gone enough. And I don't know how much of that will factor into the project or how much.
I think we've seen or heard that same story. The loyalty or the kind of the what's the word? The pull to re-sign is powerful.
I think, we've had just a few families where the father is about to be redeployed, but at least in our brief time with the family, the spouse was on board with this and understood, that they were military in a family sense, that this was something that they felt was important and that they had a duty to do, and that she was supportive of that he needed to go do this. The other issue, especially for people who've been in the Guard and the Reserve for a long time, is if they signed up, significantly before 9/11, they're nearing retirement. And so, can I hang on long enough, hopefully without a deployment, but, to get to that point? So that's another kind of issue that people are talking about. Yeah.
How do you guys feel about the fact that battle mind and sort of military culture in and of itself creates this dynamic in which the spouse is supposed to act like everything is okay at home, and so there's an automatic breakdown in communication when they're gone, because you want to make sure everything looks fine at home so that they're not stressed out in the battlefield about what's happening at home, so they can concentrate on war and feeling the peace at home. So it sort of sets up that dynamic so that when they come home, how does the service member even begin to express what happened, because you told them the whole entire time that things were fine. So it sort of creates its own conflict.
Yes, yes, that is true. I mean, I find myself thinking about other adverse circumstances that parents and families go through where there is a necessity to kind of say, we can get through this, we're going to pull together. We know it's taking a toll on us, but we're going to pull together. And I guess, and I'm speaking from extremely limited experience, you both should chime in about interviewing service members, but I think there is this sense of, we're going to do this for the greater good, and there can be a toll taken with that. And I think that's part of the battle mind psychology, right?
I think it's also the complaint that, that a lot of service members have, that they're really pissed off that their families were not supported. That the commander or the first sergeant or the FRG or whoever it was didn't even call my wife while I was deployed. So, I mean, I think that's where the deployment part of the cycle is, there needs to be more access and service and support during that time.
Well, I'm a military wife, and you can't actually access a lot of services without them even being present for things. So you're kind of left out in the cold as is because they're gone, but also that when they're gone, the world just sort of stops, but at the same time moves forward, and it becomes very difficult to balance yourself and figuring out, how do I leave an open space for them to come back to, and how do I move forward without, like the one child said in the video, without concentrating on them being gone, because time ticks so slowly when they're gone and then goes so fast when they're home.
Yeah.
That it's sort of an interesting, it's really difficult for people on the outside to experience.
Yeah.
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 All right, well, thank you all for coming. Betsy, Ellen, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot.